Hi, I'm Bill from CJ Pony Parts. If you're a subscriber to our YouTube channel, you're probably familiar with the 67 Mustang convertible. We've done a lot of upgrades to this car over the years, the most recent being a T5 swap to replace our tired 3-speed transmission. Speaking of tired, the original 289 in our car is well over 100,000 miles on it. It's definitely in need of a rebuild. While there are plenty of options for rebuilding our engine, in our case we're not terribly worried about originality, so we're going to pull our 289 and replace it with this Ford Racing crate engine. Crate engines such as this 306 cubic inch engine from Ford Racing are a nice alternative to a costly and time-consuming rebuild of the original engine. To keep costs down, they use a remanufactured crank, rods, and a block with brand new pistons, aluminum heads, high-performance camshaft, Edelbrock intake, and a Holley carburetor with an MSD distributor. This 302 is the same physical size as our 289 and will only require a few modifications to make it fit in our car. We'll be installing a new water pump which is not included with the engine, but we can use the rest of our 67 accessories. We will have to swap out the oil pan as it does come equipped with a pan for a Fox body. We'll have to install a correct front sump pan for our 67. Our Ford Racing crate engine ships ready to run, but we will still need a few parts to install it properly in our 67 Mustang. For starters, we need a fuel line adapter to connect our Holley carburetor to our factory fuel line. We'll also need an MSD ignition box such as the 6A or 6AL to run the supply distributor. Like we mentioned before, the engines do not come with a water pump or a flywheel. In the case of our 67, we already installed a T5, so we're using a late model bell housing. We used a matching 157 tooth late model billet steel Ford flywheel, go with this high flow water pump, and since the engine ships with a Fox body pan, we're going to convert to a pan and pickup that'll properly fit the front sump on our 67 Mustang. While we have the engine out, we feel it's a good time to do some upgrades as well. We're going to go with this Champion aluminum radiator, Flex-A-Lite fan, new thermostat housing as well as a new thermostat, a high flow fuel pump from Edelbrock, a brand new set of motor mounts, and a set of these billet pulleys and these blue valve covers from Ford Racing to dress up our engine bay. For this installation, you need a jack and jack stands or a lift, an engine hoist, a set of ratchets and extensions, a good set of sockets, a set of standard wrenches, a 1/4 inch Allen head, a 5/16 Allen head, a 9/64 Allen head, adjustable wrench, screwdrivers, hammer, pry bar, cordless impact and cordless drill, sawzall, needle nose pliers, wire cutters and wire strippers, 3/8 and 1/2 inch torque wrenches, flashlight, marker, and safety glasses. You'll also need 3 gallons of antifreeze, 4 quarts of ATF, 5 quarts of oil, 3/8 hose and clamps, 2 3/8 NPT to 3/8 barb fittings for your fuel pump, WD-40, grease, thread sealant, thread locker, Ziploc bags, and zip ties. Obviously, the first step is to remove our original engine. In our case, we're going to disconnect the battery, put the car up in the air, and then drain all the fluids. Start by releasing the petcock to drain the radiator. Now we're going to drain the oil next. Draining our T5 just requires a 3/8 ratchet. It goes right in this bolt here. Now that we drained our cooling system, our engine, our transmission, we're actually going to remove the transmission and the drive shaft to make it easier to remove our engine itself. We're going to start by removing the support plate installed in our convertible. On a job this size, you're going to be removing a lot of hardware. It's not a bad idea to grab some Ziploc bags, label everything as you take it apart so you remember where it goes. We have to remove the H-pipe part of our exhaust system to get our transmission out. In the case of ours, it's bolted in the front, but it's welded in the back, so we have to cut the pipe off to remove it. After cutting the H-pipe, now we can disconnect it from the header. The next step is going to be to remove our drive shaft. To do that, remove the retainers at the rear end itself. So we're going to remove the U-joint and remove the drive shaft. Once you pull the drive shaft off, a plastic bag and a zip tie, make sure any more fluid doesn't drip out of the tail shaft of your transmission. First step in removing our transmission is going to be to remove the bolts that hold our cross member to our chassis. Remove this bolt here so we can remove our speedometer cable. Before we separate the transmission from the bell housing, I want to take off the harness here for your backup lights. You pop that off. We have ours tied to our transmission, so we're going to just cut that out of the way. Now we can remove the transmission to bell housing bolts. With the trans bolts out, we can start working the transmission loose of the bell housing. A couple shakes back and forth will do it. Our plan is to try to remove the motor by keeping the bell housing attached to it. Usually we have enough space to do that. The headers might get in the way, but we're not going to know till we try. Before we can do that though, we need to disconnect our clutch cable, free it up so we can get it out of the way. We have to remove this bolt here to access the actual cable. We're going to release the lock nut here so we can release tension on the cable. Now we get a hold on the cable itself and we'll unthread the adjustment nut. We're going to remove the C-clip that holds the cable to the bell housing. I'll push the whole cable through the bell housing. The power cable for our starter comes underneath the motor mount, so we have to remove it from our starter before we try to remove the whole assembly. Now we're going to remove the bolts that hold the motor mounts to the engine itself. One here, one behind it, and then another two on this side. While we're down here, we'll get this bolt right here that has the engine's grounds on it. Now we'll remove the rubber hose from the fuel line coming in through the apron. While we're down here, we'll remove the lower radiator hose. Now that we have our 67 back on the ground, we're going to move into the engine bay and disconnect what we have to up here to get our engine out. First step, we're going to remove the hose here to get our radiator out of the way, take off the fan, and start working on the engine. Our radiator is held to our radiator support by 4 bolts. It's going to be 2 at the top and then 2 more down at the bottom. Monte Carlo bar is going to come out next. Since we're trying to pull the engine with the headers and bell housing attached, we're going to have to pull it forward to get it out. To give us some more space, we're going to pull off the fan and fan spacer. Now we're going to disconnect some of the wiring for our electric choke, oil sender, temp sensor, and some of the other wires attached to the engine. The last step for the cooling system removal is to disconnect the two heater hoses, one that goes to our intake and the other one that goes to our water pump. We're going to remove our throttle spring and disconnect our throttle linkage. Now we'll disconnect the other side, just to give us a little more space when we're working. Because we're leaving our bell housing attached, or at least going to try to, we're going to use a lift plate that actually bolts where the carburetor bolts to lift our engine out of place. So to do so, we're going to remove the carburetor. First remove the fuel line, then the 4 retaining nuts that hold the carburetor to the intake manifold. With our carburetor off, we can install our lift plate. The last step of getting the engine out of the car is going to be to remove the hood. It's not necessary to remove it, but it's going to give you more room to work with, so we're going to take it off. To pull the engine out of the car is going to require a cherry picker like this. If you don't have one, the light-duty ones are actually surprisingly easy to afford, plus a lot of places will rent one to you. Well, close but no cigar. Our aftermarket headers are going to hit our export brace. We simply don't have enough space to get it past them, so we're going to remove the export brace to get our engine out of the car. Now that we have our engine out, there's a few things we're going to take off this engine and put onto our new motor. For starters, we're going to keep the alternator since it's fairly new. We're going to need the bell housing, the clutch. We're going to hang on to our headers as well. Put the engine on an old tire, makes a great stand to work on it. Next, we'll remove the 2 bolts that hold the starter to our bell housing. Now we'll remove the bell housing bolts. Next we'll remove the clutch. Even though our flywheel is fairly new from our T5 conversion, it's balanced at 28 ounces, which will work with the vintage motor, but will not work with the new Ford racing engine, which is balanced at 50 ounces. Now the last part we're going to take off our old engine for now is going to be the headers. Now we've got all the parts we need off our old engine, ready to prepare our new engine for installation. In our case, the first thing we're going to do is swap out the included valve covers for our blue Ford Racing. Now we're going to get a closer look at the roller rockers Ford provides on the engine. When tightening down your valve covers, you want to start with the bolts in the center and then work your way outward. Now we're ready to install our high flow water pump. The pump comes with the gasket. We also sell a bolt kit which comes with everything you need as well as a detailed diagram. The easiest way to get started is to use these 3 bolts here as a basis for getting the pump mounted, since all 3 are the same size. They're the easiest ones to use. Just going to get them snug for now. You don't have to tighten them all the way down just yet. Now we can install the rest of the bolts according to the diagram. The last 2 bolts we're going to install are going to be these 2 right here. If you have a power steering car, the power steering bracket mounts behind the bolts. It's a manual steering like our 67. You want to install the 2 supplied washers. Now we'll torque everything to 13.5 foot-pounds. We're ready to start mounting the accessories on the front of the engine. We're going to start with the alternator. Instead of using the old brackets, we're going to use these new chrome brackets. Just want to get it snug so it still moves freely. The upper bracket's going to mount right here to these water pump bolts. We're going to move both those bolts and install our upper bracket. With our alternator brackets on the engine, we're ready to mount our alternator. Our Ford Racing pulley kit comes with this 2-piece billet pulley, so first we're going to pull the stock pulley off and swap it out. Now we can mount our alternator to our engine. Spacer in place and line everything up, thread it in. Going to tighten down enough that it still can turn. I'll bring the lower bracket into place. We'll leave that loose for now so we can get the belt in place, and then we'll tighten it down and adjust it. Now we can move on to our crank pulley. The pulleys we're using are designed by March to work with the 4-bolt crank on our modern engine, but you still use the factory-style early accessories. In our case, we're going with a twin groove on the crank as well as the water pump. We're doing that so we can add power steering in the future. The water pump pulley is held on by the screws that go through our fan and our fan spacer. We're not going to install them at this time because the fans can get in the way when we put our engine back in our car. When it goes together, it's going to look something like this when it's finished. We'll be using a mechanical fuel pump with our engine. Ford provides this block-off plate, but there isn't a eccentric installed, so you can use a mechanical pump. You simply remove the block-off plate to install the pump. The pump will slide straight in. If it doesn't line up with the holes, you don't want to force it into place. You want to crank the engine over until it moves the cam enough that the pump lines up. Now we can put our gasket on and we'll install our pump. Now we can install our thermostat and our thermostat housing. thermostat installs in the housing with a spring facing towards the engine, and the gasket goes on like this before the assembly goes onto the car. I found putting a little spray glue on the gasket will help keep the gasket and the thermostat seated, making sure you don't get a leak when you install it. Let's let that dry for a minute before we install it. Next, we're going to install a new oil pressure sensor and the extension. To do so, we have to remove the plug that Ford supplies in the block. We'll start with the extension. You want to put a little thread sealant on the threads before you install it. Our new sensor already has thread sealant installed, so we can thread it around to our extension. The supplied dipstick and tube's not going to work with our new pan in our 67 Mustang, so we're going to remove the dipstick and tube before we remove the pan. Ford ships our crate engine without oil in it, so we can simply flip it over and remove the pan. The 4 bolts on the end caps are going to be larger, and there's smaller bolts holding the pan to the block. Once the pan's off, you have to replace your oil pump pickup as well. You can see the pickup's designed for the Fox body. The one we're going to be installing is designed for the front sump we're going to use in our 67. Before we install the new pan, we're going to pull off the gasket, replace it with a new one. I know it's a brand new gasket on a brand new engine, but better safe than sorry. Now we can install the correct pickup with the new gasket. While you have the pan off, you want to tap out that insert in the front so you can use the correct style dipstick and tube for our 67. Before we can install our pan, we have to address this hole here. This is where the factory included dipstick goes into the block. Obviously, we're not using it because we're using the dipstick in the front. You could try putting the metal tab in that you removed. I wouldn't suggest it. In our case, we're going to tap it and install a plug. Spray a little oil in there for the tap. Put a dab of thread sealant on the plug and we'll install it. Now we can put our gasket on and prepare to install our new pan. Now we can put the 67 front sump style pan on. We're just about ready to put our engine back in our 67 Mustang. Since we were able to get the old engine out with the headers attached, we're going to install them on the stand, which makes it a lot easier than trying to install them in the car. Now we have our headers installed. We're going to install the lift plate and get the engine ready to go back in the car. We have our 306 off the engine stand and hooked up to our crane. We're just about ready to start reinstalling it. Before doing so though, we're going to install a few things that are much easier to install here than actually in the car. We're going to start with the flywheel, then install the clutch, the bell housing, and finally the starter before we install everything else. The first step is to install a pilot bushing because the engine does not include one. You want to install the correct pilot bearing or pilot bushing depending on your application. In our case, we're using a T5, so we're going to install the pilot bushing. It gets hammered into place. An easy way to do so is to get a 1-inch or equivalent socket, fits over the bearing, line it up, and hammer it in. Put the separator plate on first, and then we can install our flywheel. You want to use a dab of Loctite on all the bolts for the flywheel. Now we're going to torque all these bolts down to 85 foot-pound. Now we can install our clutch. The clutches come with a plastic alignment tool. You get your hands on an old input shaft from a transmission, it does a much better job. Once the bolts are installed, we'll torque to 35 foot-pound. Once we're torqued down, we can remove our alignment tool. Move on to the bell housing. Now we'll torque to 25 foot-pound. Now that our bell housing is installed, we're going to move on to our starter. Move on to our motor mounts. And the last step before we put our engine in, install our new dipstick and tube. Give our engine bay a quick cleaning, so the last thing to do before we can install our new engine is remove the old mounts. We've done everything we could do on the stand, so now it's time to put our crate engine into our Mustang. Once you get the engine dropped down into place on your motor mounts, you probably want to get some help because it's going to be kind of tough to get the engine to line up with the bolts for your motor mounts. Now we have the bolts on, we'll put the retaining nuts in place. Since we have the car up in the air to tighten the motor mounts, now is as good a time as any to put the transmission back in the car. They're cross member mounted. We can reinstall our drive shaft. Move towards the front and reroute our clutch cable. We didn't tighten the lock nut down yet because we're sure we're going to have to adjust our cable once we get it back together. We put it roughly where it was before. We'll do fine adjustments once the car's back on the ground and running. I'll reconnect our speedometer cable. Don't forget while you're down here to plug in your backup lights. We'll tie the harness out of the way. That's it for down here for now. We're going to put the car back on the ground and go up to the engine bay. We're going to start with the cooling system now. We got to install the temp sensor as well as the heater hose elbow onto our intakes. We're going to start by removing these two plugs. You want to start with the temp sensor. Put a little thread sealant on before you install in the intake. Our heater hose elbow actually is going to hit our distributor when we try to install it. As soon as we go to turn it, we're going to pop the distributor out so we can get this threaded in place. We're going to put our distributor back in our engine. Don't worry about getting it installed properly. We have to take it right back out once we prime our engine. We won't be needing our lift plate anymore, so we can take that off. Reinstall our carburetor. We'll start with our heater hose connections. Their heater hose is mounted. Now we can move on to the radiator. Our Champion's going to bolt right to our stock mount. Now we can install our water pump pulley and our fan. Now we can put our belt on. Next we'll put on our upper radiator hose. Now that most of our cooling connections are finished, we're going to start working on our wiring next. On our old motor, our coil was mounted over here on the passenger side. We have plenty of room on the driver's side, so we're going to move it over here. Then we're going to connect our oil pressure sensor as well as our temp sensor. Start by mounting the bracket to the head. Grab our new MSD blaster coils. Will work well with our MSD ignition and MSD distributor. Put that in place, and we'll fish the ignition line over to our distributor. This is the factory harness that's going to go out to our engine. This black fitting down here is for our oil pressure sender. This is for the temp sender. This one would normally go to the coil. It's a 12-volt switched power. Since we're using an MSD ignition, we're going to use that to switch the ignition to turn it on, which that'll in turn power the coil. Moving over to the passenger side, we'll connect our alternator harness. Put that in, and the ground for that, as well as the ground for the battery, will be underneath the car. We'll also reconnect our ground to the back of the head back here. Now reconnect 12 volts to the electric ground on our motor. Now we'll ground the alternator and the battery to the block. Move back now and connect our starter wire. I'll put the lower radiator hose up into place. There's a bracket that might be in the way of the upper connection on the water pump, and you want to move it before you put the hose in. We're going to be using MSD's digital 6A ignition box to work with the distributor provided in our Ford Racing crate engine. The wiring may look a little intimidating, but overall it really isn't too bad. The red and black go to power and ground respectively. This purple and green plug here will plug right into our distributor. If you weren't using an MSD distributor, this white wire here will work with a point style ignition. The orange and brown are going to go to our blaster 2 coil. The red is 12 volt switch to turn on our ignition, and the gray will work with an aftermarket tachometer. We're going to mount our MSD ignition right here on the apron. Since most of the wiring's in this area, it should make it a little bit easier to wire. We know the cam on our engine is going to have a little bit of a rowdy idle. Because it's an electronic component, we want to dampen a little bit some of the vibrations we're going to get from the idle. What we did, we took some unneeded fuel hose, cut these little spacers out, we'll put between the ignition and the metal, which will help dampen it. Plug our harness in, we'll start making our connections. Start laying out our wiring. We'll fish these across our radiator support. We'll tie them in here out of the way. White feed is not used. We'll take that out of our harness. Gray wire is going to go to our tack feed underneath our dash. The remaining 3 wires should bring behind our washer bag. Plug our feed into our distributor. Use one of the MSD supply terminals on our 12 volt switch from our ignition. And then connect that to the 12 volt switch lead for our MSD ignition. Now we'll connect the orange and black leads to our blaster coil. You don't over tighten these, just get them snug. Now we'll hook up to 12 volts. We're not going to connect to the battery yet, we're just going to put it on the terminal. And same with the ground. We still have to hook up fuel, set the timing, prime the oiling system, a few other things before the engine will actually run. Curiosity's getting the best of us though. We're going to test the ignition just to see if it'll bump over. Sweet, we're good. Now we can move on to the fuel system. We'll start the fuel system by putting the fuel line onto our carburetor. A little bit of thread sealant on the threads before we install. Now we'll install a 3/8 NPT barb fitting on our fuel pump to connect to our fuel line. Again, put some thread sealant on there. Now we'll install the other fitting into our fuel pump so we can connect to our factory fuel line. Our next step is going to be to prime our oil pump. Before we do so, we got to fill our engine with oil. We're using 5 quarts of standard 1040 oil for the break-in. About 500 miles out, you probably want to change it, then you can go to synthetic, whatever else you want to run. To prime our oil pump, we got to remove the distributor, and then we'll actually put a drill on the oil pump and turn it to build up pressure. Since we're taking the distributor out, we will have to reset the timing on the engine. To do that, we're actually going to pull all the spark plugs out, making the engine much easier to turn so we can find top dead center. We're going to make a mark on the distributor where number 1 is. And we'll need an impact gun or a drill, a long 1/4 inch extension, and a 1/4 inch socket. If you have a locking extension, you're good to go. If you don't, I'd recommend taping this to the extension. You don't want to lose it inside the engine. Now you want to run it reverse until you start seeing oil come up inside there. Now we're going to try to find close to top dead center so we can reinstall our distributor. Not a bad idea to get a little bit of help for this part. You want to put your finger in the number 1 cylinder hole and then turn the engine until you feel it pop when you're on the compression stroke. Now that we're on the compression stroke, we're going to put a screwdriver in the hole, turn the engine until the screwdriver lifts all the way up to its top point. I want to turn our rotor just past our paint mark for number 1 because once we drop the distributor in, it is going to spin. And the last step before we can try starting the engine is hook up our throttle rod. Put a washer on and put a cotter pin in to hold it in place. Now we'll install the plate for the throttle return spring. We took off our old motor. Now that our throttle's hooked up, we'll give everything a once over and we'll fire it up. Normally you want to put your exhaust on first, but we want to hear this thing with open headers. Now we're going to try cranking the engine a few times. It'll take a while for it to start because we have to get fuel in the line. The pump has to pull it up into our carburetor before it'll even run. All right, go ahead. Woo! Our Ford Racing crate engine sounds absolutely sick with the open headers. Now we're going to reinstall our suspension, put some fluid in the transmission, and fill the radiator and get this thing ready to get back on the road. Take a couple gallons to fill the system initially and probably another gallon once we get all the air out of the system with the engine running. Now we can fill our transmission with ATF. You want to fill it until the fluid comes back out the fill hole where you're putting it in. We decided to add a little bit of show to all the go that we're adding, so instead of putting our mismatched silver and black Export Racing Monte Carlo bar, we're going to upgrade to a pair of matched chrome premium products. So that's the basics on how to install a Ford Racing crate engine into your classic Mustang. On our particular 67, we do still have a couple issues we need to address. The engine includes an air gap intake, which is taller than the stock intake. It's going to create a clearance problem with our hood, so we are going to have to go with an aftermarket hood in the future. You may also notice we did not install our exhaust system. The exhaust on the car just wasn't up to par with this engine, so in a future video, we're going to do an exhaust upgrade as well. While this is not an easy installation, something you and a couple of friends could definitely tackle over a weekend, and you'll be back on the road in no time.